Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we discussed about the throw keyword here. So how the throw keyword is working internally, we identified here. So this is the syntax we are following here to come up with so to use this particular throw keyword. So whenever we are trying to throw an exception, either we are trying to handle here, and from here, whenever we are trying to rethrow an exception, so this particular location is going to handle here because so this is the hierarchy how it is calling internally. From this particular method, something like a demo NPA, from the demo NPA we are calling it, and this is the demo NPA is going to handle the exception information, and whenever it is trying to rethrow an exception, so at the line number 9 and 10, we are trying to handle this particular exception here. Okay, so this is the example we discussed in the last session. Now you can see first it is calling from the demo NP and later it is calling from the main method. Okay, so this is all about the new keyword which was discussed in the last session, that is called throw keyword. So today we are going to discuss about the throws keyword. Getting the point. So today we are going to discuss about the throws keyword. So what exactly the throws keyword is going to use here? Basically, if the method is capable, so whenever the method is causing an exception, getting the point. So this is important here. The method is capable, like the method can handle if any exception is going to throw here. So instead of handle the particular exception, what we need to understand basically, what we need to understand basically here, we need to understand if the same method, if we are not throwing an exception, we can use this particular throws keyword if you are not handling the any exception. So handling the exception is nothing but if you are not interested to come up with a try catch block. If you are not interested to come up with a try catch block, now what we can do, we can go for this particular throws keyword. So basically the throws class, it's going to handle the method exceptions. It's going to handle the different types of exception at method level. Getting the point? It's going to handle the exception at method level. So now observe the simple example so that we'll get to know how this particular throws keyword is going to use. So yesterday we discussed about the throw keyword. Now we are discussing about the throws here. Now you can see what I will do here. I'm going to throw in something different exception here. Okay, so this is the method I'm declaring is throw one. So basically this particular throw one, what it will do, I'm going to create a method and this is the method I'm creating internally, and observe carefully. So here what I'm doing is I'm going to print the sysout statement inside throw one method. Okay, now what I'm doing here, so here something like getting the point. So basically this one is a illegal access exception we are trying to throw. Now observe carefully what happening internally. So if you see carefully, here we are getting two options. So what are all the two options we are getting basically? So either whenever we are trying to throw in any exception, either now what we can do, we can come up with a try catch block, or we should use this particular throws declaration. So if I'm going to use this, now observe carefully what happening internally and here which keyword we are using. So if you observe carefully, we are trying to use a throws keyword, not the throw keyword. So here we are using the throw keyword, and here we are using the throws keyword. So here, why I am using this throw, the same exception here. Basically, at this method level, whatever the method we are using, the throw one method, I'm not interested to handle this particular exception. I'm not interested to handle this particular exception. So what is an exception? I'm not interested basically. The exception called illegal access exception. Okay. So if you observe carefully, one more exception. Instead of this particular illegal access exception, if I'm going to move null pointer, if I'm going to move this particular null pointer exception, now I'm not going to get any error. So observe carefully. I'm not getting any error. So why I'm not getting any error? So what is the difference between illegal access exception as well as this particular null pointer exception? So what is the differences we are having? So earlier, whatever I used here, the illegal access exception, if I'm not using this, if I'm not using this particular throws keyword, so here I'm getting an error. So the line number 12, I'm getting an error. But the same I implemented for the null pointer exception, I'm not getting any error. Okay, so first I will see this exception here, information. So the exception basically is extending with which exception class? Okay, is extending reflective operation exception. So this is the super class for this particular illegal access exception. And finally, I'm trying to extend this particular class. So now if you observe carefully, so this class is extending from the exception class. So I explained in the few like last session basically, if any class is extending from the exception class, so those classes we are going to call it as a checked exception. Okay, and if any one of the class is extending from the runtime exception, runtime exception, the runtime exception class is basically unchecked exception. Okay, the simple example, null pointer exception is the unchecked exception, and whatever we are discussing, the illegal access exception is a checked exception. So the difference is basically checked exception we are going to handle at compile time, and runtime exception we can handle at runtime. So checked exception basically, if you are missing handle any exceptions information, either using the try catch block or throws keyword. So we are going to get a compilation error. So how we are getting this compilation error? Now you can see. So this is the compilation error we are going to get. So forcefully, if you observe carefully, even this particular exception is not going to throw any case, but what we are doing is we are trying to handle this with the try catch block, or we are going to use a rethrowing concept here. Basically, using this particular throws, basically we are trying to rethrow the exception. So from where we are trying to rethrow an exception? From throw one. So inside this particular throw one, we are trying to throw an exception, and here we are having an option. So directly here only we can handle an exception. Directly here only we can handle an exception. If you are not interested inside this particular throw one method, now what we are trying to do? So using this particular throws keyword, we are rethrowing an exception. Okay, so this is nothing but, so just we are handling an exception, and from where this method is going to call, so at the time of calling, there also we can handle an exception, otherwise we can rethrow the same exception here. So now observe carefully here, the throw one is going in it's showing like it's giving me a compilation error. So here also it's showing two options. So either we can throw the same exception, or we can handle with the try catch block. So if I'm going to use this particular throws declaration, if I'm going to use this particular same, whatever the exception we are trying to throw here, so here I'm trying to rethrow the exception, and at the main method level, at this particular main method level, again we are trying to rethrow this particular same exception here. Okay, now what happens internally? So if I'm going to run this particular exception, so now observe carefully, inside this particular throw one method, so this particular sysout is printing, and later we are throwing an exception. whenever we are throwing an exception, if we are not interested to handle with a try catch block, so using this particular throws keyword, we are saying inside this particular throw one method, I'm not interested to handle the exception. So because of that, I'm trying to rethrow the exception. I'm trying to rethrow the exception. So this is the way we are going to rethrow the exception here. Okay. So this is the way we are going to rethrow this particular exception. And at the time of main method calling, again, we are saying here we are trying to rethrow the exception. Basically, whenever you are trying to rethrow the exception, the default handler. So this message is going to give from the default exception. The try catch block is going to provide the information. Okay. Now, if I'm not interested to handle this particular rethrow the concept here. So what is the best way here? So we can go for the try and catch here. So using this particular try and catch here, we can handle this particular exception and you can print this. So we'll see what happened this particular print to stack trace method, what it will do. This particular print to stack trace method, what it will do. So we need to understand. Now you can see it is giving me the exception hierarchy from where it is calling and what is the purpose of this particular exception here. Okay. So this is we need to understand about the simple example on the throws keyword. So now you can see from the basically from this particular line number 7 it is called, and from line number 17 we are trying to throw an exception here. And what is the exception we are having here? So this is the access related exception we are trying to throw. Okay. So this is the description we are having, and name of the exception is that, and this is the message we define inside this particular throw one method here. Okay. So basically, if you are not interested to handle this particular exception, so using the try catch block, and what is the best way here? Using this particular throws keyword, we can rethrow the exception. So whenever we are trying to rethrow the exception, from where this method is going to call, it will go to the particular location inside the main method. So basically in this example we are calling the main method, but in the real time example basically the methods are going to call from the different classes here. The methods are going to call from the different classes. So for example, some controller to service method, service to repository method. So inside the repository, if you are trying to throw an exception, so using the keyword call throws here. So using this particular keyword, if you are trying to rethrow an exception, it will go to the service method. So here you can handle the exception using try catch block, or you can go for the same the concept to call, use this particular throws keyword. So whenever you are trying to use this particular throws keyword, it will come back to this particular controller class. Again, inside this particular controller class, again we are going to have a two option. So using the try and catch here. So using this try and catch here. So otherwise, what happens internally? Otherwise, what happens internally? We can use here also throws keyword. Here also you can use this particular throws keyword. So whenever we are using this controller method, this default the exception, the try catch block is going to handle it. Okay. But instead of doing the rethrowing concept in the controller class, what is the best way? You can write here using the try and catch here. So using this particular try and catch, you can write the code and you can handle the exception. So here we can provide the whatever the message we are expecting here. Okay, so this is important. We need to understand whenever we are trying to use this particular throws keyword. So any questions? Any questions regarding this particular throws keyword here?
Sir, I have a question, sir. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, after you're done, I will.
Okay, thank you. Sir, so first, with the beginning of try block, it is going to throw one method. There, throw new illegal access exception means it is creating an exception.
Yes.
Okay. And then throws illegal access exception means it doesn't want to handle the same exception.
Yes, basically, so whenever we are trying to throw this particular exception, so we need to handle this exception because here we are trying to throw an exception.
Okay.
Okay, where we are going to handle basically. So using the try catch block, we already identified we can handle an exception. But inside this method, so throw one method, I'm not interested to handle this exception. So if you are not interested, basically, I'm giving you this particular option here. I'm trying to rethrow. Okay, so whenever we are trying to rethrow the exception, from where this method is going to call. So from where this particular method is going to call, at the time of calling the same location, we can handle with either try catch block or we can use the same keyword to rethrow the exception. Basically, every time we'll have a two options. So either we can handle with the try catch block or we can rethrow the exception.
Okay. So
Okay.
that means, sorry.
Yes, tell me.
So that means you can write again throws illegal access exception near throw one method where you have declared throw one method.
Yes.
Okay. But you use try catch instead to handle the exception.
Yes, basically, if you are not interested this try catch plus, again we can use the same this particular throws keyword.
Okay. Then when you ran the program, why is there the exception again, sir? It should handle
Because
the exception.
see here I'm not writing any message here. I'm trying to print this particular stack trace from where to where this method is calling here.
Okay, but there is no exception now in the program.
Yes, we are getting an exception this line number 17. The exception we are handling line number 8.
Okay. So if you don't use e.print stack trace, what is the output, sir? Only inside throw one method?
Nothing is there. If I'm trying to print basically the catch block will handle an exception. But once a catch block is handled, if you want to write any logic, you can write inside this block. So otherwise, if I'm trying to print this, nothing will print, only one message.
Okay, yeah. This was my question. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, basically the stack is going to print by this method. So that's why I added this particular method.
Okay, that means we have handled the exception here using
Yes.
whatever we have done. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so
I have one doubt.
Okay.
What is the superclass for null point exception, sir?
Okay. So if I'm going to expand this, now you can see it is a runtime exception. Okay, and the reflective operation is extending from the exception. So see the differences here. So any class, any exception class is extending this exception. So those classes we need to handle at compilation time. Compilation time is nothing but while developing the code, we are going to handle like this. So either try catch block or using this particular throws. Because if you are not handling what happening, it's throwing a compilation error basically. It's giving the compilation error. But same thing if I did inside this particular null pointer exception some here. So if I come up with this particular null pointer exception, it will not give any error at compilation time, but runtime it will get an exception basically.
Yeah, I got it, sir. What is the superclass for null pointer exception? Like compile time exceptions, the superclass is exception class. So, is there any class for this runtime exception superclass, sir? From where it
So,
is?
See, basically runtime exception again internally is extending from the exception only.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but here the problem, all the unchecked exception classes are going to extend this particular class. So runtime exception class, not the exception here. So that's why I'm repeating here. So you can see the reflective operation exception is extending from the exception, and the illegal access exception basically is extending this. So see the hierarchy. So this is the exception. Okay, and exception is internally extended by this particular reflective operation, and from the reflective operation, so is extending illegal access. But the null pointer basically, so is extending from the runtime exception. From the runtime exception is going to extend from this particular null pointer exception, and runtime exception internally is extending from the exception class. Okay, finally this exception is same, but instead of this particular reflective operation, instead of extending this particular runtime exception, is directly is extending from the exception class. So here the hierarchy is missing here. So all the classes, they are not extending from the runtime. Few of the classes directly is extending from this particular exception class. Okay, how this runtime is extending? So same way, some of the classes are extending this particular exception. So if I want to say this hierarchy basically, exception is the base class. It will try to extend the multiple child classes, and inside the child class, we are going to extend one runtime exception here. Okay, so this is we need to understand. Whatever the classes we are trying to extend these many classes basically, so is going to, these classes will call it as a checked exception. These classes, okay, and how many classes are extending this runtime exception? All the runtime exception classes will call it as a unchecked exception. Okay, this is the differences basically here.
Yeah. Okay, sir. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so now we'll move on to the finally keyword. The finally keyword basically it's going to create a one block of code basically, and the particular code is going to execute either if you get any exception or if you are not getting any exception. Is nothing but the finally block is going to execute every time. Getting the point. So this is basically, it is the important one, and which scenario this particular finally block is going to use. The finally blocks basically it's going to use whenever we are trying to opening any resource related information. So for example, I want to open some connection related information, and those connection information we are going to open under this particular try block. But either like if we get any exception, if we are not getting any exception, the connection should close here. So whatever the connection, or you can see, so I'm trying to connect with another application. So if I want to connect to another application, we need some connection related information or resource related information, some security related information. So those information we are going to write inside try block. Okay. So once we define this particular code, if the exception is occur, or the without any exception, if the code is executed successfully, what we need basically, we need to close the connections here, because this is the one type of application, and this is the another type of application. From here we are trying to connect to the one more application. So to connect to this basically we need some resources here. So the resource we are going to create, and once the operation is completed, we need to close this particular resources here. So closing this particular resource basically we are going to use inside the particular finally block here. Okay, this is important here. The finally block basically it's going to execute every time here. So this is the important information we need to understand. So let me move on to this particular finally block, how this particular finally block will execute. So here I'm going to write here. Okay, inside this particular like a null pointer exception related example, I'm going to add this particular finally statement basically. So what exactly it is doing? So finally in this particular main method, and now what I will do, the same code I'm going to copy into this particular demo in P method, and now if I'm going to run this particular example, so you can observe carefully. First is it is calling this particular catch block. Once the catch block is handled, now it is moving on to the finally block. So finally block from the demo NP method, and the same way because of this particular rethrowing concept here. So again we are trying to come up with the try catch block from this particular main method, and from the main method finally block also is executing. So for example, I'm not using this particular rethrowing concept here. I'm not using the rethrowing concept here. So if I'm going to run the same example one more time, now you can see what happening internally. Only one exception here. Only one exception, that is going to handle from line number 22. So once it is handled, first it is executing the finally block in the demo np method, and after that the finally block is executing from the main method. Now what you understand basically, the previous example we identified, even if you get any exception, the finally block is executing. And now this exception is the catch block is not executing now. Whatever the line number 10, the message we defined here, the message is not printing here. So what you understand here, this catch block is now it is not handling the exception. So in that case, like we are not getting any exception. So whatever the code we define the demo NP, it is happily executed without any exception. So even though if you are not getting any exception, the finally block is executing here. Okay, so this is important here. So basically most of the cases in the real time scenarios I'm giving an information, most of the cases like 99 cases we are going to close the resources. What kind of the resource we are going to open, so those information we are going to close inside this particular finally block. And here if any cases, either the exception is occur or if the exception is not occur, if you want to execute something, getting the one, if you want to execute something, those particular code you can write under this particular finally block. For example, so if you get any exception or if you are not getting any exception, I want to load the data from the database, or I want to call the another application to retrieve some data information. So in that case, no need to write the same code inside this particular try block. Getting the point? So it is the best way to write the code inside this particular finally block. Getting the point? The finally block every time is going to execute. But for example, if you are trying to write the code in the try block, what happens here? In case if you get any exception, the below lines of code is not going to execute. And if you write in the catch block, what happens inside the catch block? Basically, what happens whenever we are getting an exception, so once we get an exception, then only whatever the code we are going to write inside the catch block, so those particular codes are going to execute it here. Okay, the best way we are writing inside the finally, any cases, the finally block is going to execute here. Okay, so and here one more important information I want to say. See, in the real time scenarios, we are not going to write this only single line. We are going to write, for example, if you are trying to save the data. Okay, so for example, you are trying to save the data into the some database here, or if you are trying to save the data into the cloud. So whenever you are trying to save the data into cloud, what happens basically? First, we need a connection. Getting the point? We need a connection to communicate with the cloud related technologies here. So those connections we are going to write in the try block. Okay, so while opening the connection, so because if you get any exception because of the network or the cloud is down something, so we'll get the multiple exception in the cloud related environment. So in that case, what happens is we are unable to save the object into this particular cloud environment. Now what we can do, So those inside situations, basically, we need to write the code in the catch block, and we can write the status code. So why the particular object is not going to save the data into the particular cloud environment. So you can modify the status of the particular status of the object here, and we can write the status code and the status error, getting the point, and we can save into the same object one more time, or we can roll back our current changes. So these are all the way of writing the information inside the catch block. So you cannot understand catch block can contain thousands of lines code basically. If you observe carefully in the real-time application, catch block will contain more line of code compared to this particular try block here. So this is important here. Inside the try block, if you write the few lines, like if you are going to write only 4 lines of code, but the catch block can contain around 40 lines of code here. So this is we are going to write in the catch block, because so inside the catch block, the exception information we are going to write, and the object we are going to roll back the object, and we are going to provide the status information. Again, if we get something, again we are going to store in the different tables or different cloud environment. So one cloud is down, we'll move on to the another cloud. But how we are going to connect this another cloud? We are going to connect in the catch block only. Okay, for future references, basically nowadays all the applications, they are trying to store the data into the multiple tables basically, or we can call it as a multiple cloud environments here. One cloud is down, we are going to check in the different cloud. So why the original object is down? So what is the error code, and what is the status about the particular object? Okay, so those information we are going to write inside the catch block. Now you can think here how much the catch block is important here. Okay, so this is all about the all the keyword, whatever the keyword we discuss here. First we discuss about the try block here, and second we discuss about the catch block here, and third we discuss about the finally, and fourth we discuss about the throw keyword, and the last keyword throws keyword. Okay, so any questions regarding this particular 5 keyword? So using this particular 5 keyword, we can handle an exception, we can create the custom exception, getting the point. So any exception related information we can handle using this particular 5 keywords basically. Okay, so anyone having any questions?
Sir, I have a question. Sir, what is happening at line 23? Throw EX.
So that we already discussed. Basically, if you are interested to rethrow an exception, so using this particular throw keyword, we are able to provide the object information. So basically, EX is the reference of this particular null pointer exception, where we created the null pointer exception object in the line number 20. Okay, so that is I'm passing it to rethrow the exception.
And then it is going back to the above catch.
Yes.
Block. Okay. Okay. Sir, can we handle more than one exception using try catch?
So that example we already discussed in the last session. You can see here we are handling multiple exceptions.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So any other questions? Okay. So now we need to understand some of the built-in exception basically. So what are all the built-in exception we are having? And here we identified arithmetic exception, and array index out of bound exception we identified, and class cast exception basically. Okay, class cast exception basically what it will do, it will try to give the exception whenever we are trying to converting one data type into another data type here. So if I'm going to provide the class cast exception, so now you can see this is the class cast exception, and you can see it is extending from the runtime exception. Now what you understand basically, this is the unchecked exception. Now you can see, so this is the message will give you the information about the purpose of this particular class cast here. Okay, so this particular throw to indicate that the code attempt to cast an object into a subclass of the which is not an instance. So whenever we are trying to converting so unknown unknown object to type here, basically we'll get an this particular exception here. Okay, so you can see it's giving me an example here. So we are creating integer object here. Getting the point? We are creating integer object. Now you can see the type basically they are providing as a super type. They are providing super type. But here, which object we are creating? Child class. It's a subclass. So object is a super class and integer is a subclass. Now what I am doing here, whatever the x we are getting here, the x I am trying to converting into this particular string data type here. X I'm trying to converting into this particular string data type because X is a integer data type. But here what we are doing is we are converting into this particular string. So this is not the expected behavior. So in that situation, we'll get this particular exceptions here. Okay, and you can see it is coming from the 1.0 onwards here. Okay, this is also one of the important exception. Most of the time we are going to get whenever you are trying to write the applications. Okay, and one more basically, so we discuss about the illegal argument exception, and you can identify the index out of bound exception. So index out of bound exception. Now if you see basically this exception internally is extending from the runtime exception. Okay, this is internally is extending from the runtime exception. But whatever the exception we discuss here, array index out of bound exception. So now observe carefully. Array index out of bound exception is a subclass of index out of bound exception. Array index out of bound exception is a subclass of this particular index here. Okay, index out of bound exception internally is extending from the this particular runtime exception. Okay, so this class is also again unchecked exception. So this is we already identified here. Basically, this is the super class is going to handle the such indexes related exceptions here. Okay, inside this particular index related exception, the one example we identified that is called array index out of bound exception. Okay, now you can see, so we have a one more exception here, something like a string index out of bound exception. So now you can see this is the string index out of bound exception. So whenever, so now you can observe the string index out of bound exception internally is extending from the index out of bound exception. Same way, array index is also extending from the index out of bound exception. Okay, all the indexes related exception, this is the superclass. Now, what happening internally? Whenever you are trying to call, so string dot caret, getting the string dot caret, whatever you are trying to provide this particular into value, if it is not available, right now we cannot understand this particular caret here. Okay, so basically caret is the one method which is available inside this particular string class. Getting the point? So whatever you are providing this particular into value, the into value internally is going to work as a index here. Internally is going to work as a index here. So whatever the given index is not available, we'll get this particular exception here. The string out index out of bound exception. Okay, again this particular class is also runtime exception. And one more class. So we have a multiple exception classes here. Number format exception. Okay, so number format exception basically what exactly it is doing internally. Now if you observe carefully, whenever you are trying to parse into, okay, whenever you are trying to converting one data type into another data, basically this is the string. This is the string value. Now what I am doing is, so using this particular parse int, basically I am trying to converting into number type. Okay, I'm trying to converting into this particular number type. So inside this particular situation, so we are going to get this particular exception called number format exception, and internally is extending illegal argument exception. So why this class is extending by this particular exception class, illegal argument? Because whatever you are providing, this is an argument we are going to call. The argument is this, it is not the expected matching argument here. because basically we should pass a number value. So whenever you are trying to converting into this into data type, into data type here, we need to provide the number related value. So for example, you can provide the double type or you can provide the char type, but you cannot provide the string type here. So this is the illegal argument here. Okay, so because of that is extending this particular number format exception class from the illegal argument exception here. Okay, so this is the way we can identify what are all the built-in exception we are having. Okay, we are having multiple exception built-in classes, but so those built-in classes are not going to use in the real-time example. Okay, so these classes will handle an exception, but most of the cases we are going to write a custom exception. For example, so if I want to, like we are trying to develop the particular any banking related applications. So for example, if you are trying to define the banking related application, so for user like saving account, we are going to have different exception. Current account, we are going to have different exception. Okay, for loan department, we are going to have different exceptions here. So those exceptions we are going to write as a custom exception. Those exceptions we cannot use as a built-in exceptions what we are having right now. Okay, getting the point. So based on the applications, based upon the applications what we are developing here, the exceptions we are going to write as a custom exceptions here. So now we'll move on to the custom exceptions here. So what is the best way of writing the custom exception? But if we observe carefully, all the exceptions, getting the point, all the exceptions internally, so this is the way they are going to write. First one is a default constructor, and second one is a parameterized constructor, and third one basically this is a method. Okay, so this is basically they come up with a method here, and another one. So this is a one more method they are using static method. So these are the static method basically introduced from the 1.8 onwards. But now what you need to understand this information. If you write any exception class, if you write any exception class, you can extend from the runtime exception or you can extend from the exception class. So if you are extending from the exception, those classes we are going to call it as a checked exception, and if you are extending from the runtime exception, those classes we can call it as a unchecked exception. But the problem basically what you need to understand. So what happens internally? Whenever I'm trying to call this particular super, okay, so what is the class is going to execute here? Which class is going to execute this particular super keyboard? Now understand carefully. For example, what is the super class for this particular number format exception? What is the super class? The super class basically this is the number class, illegal argument exception. Illegal argument exception is a super class. Now we'll see how this particular illegal argument exception is going to handle the parameter here. Now I'm extending this. So if you observe carefully, again we are calling this super here. Okay, this exception is called from the number format exception with the one parameter, and internally we are calling the same super here. Whenever I'm calling, so what is a super exception here? Runtime exception. Now observe carefully. I'm moving into the runtime exception. Inside the runtime exception is also, again we are using the super here. Again we are using the super. Now you can see, so it's having two parameters. Again we are calling the same super. So this is the one more super here. Okay, so these are all the different we are having here. Now observe carefully. It is calling exception. So from this particular exception, again we are calling the super. So again we are calling the same super. Whenever I'm calling the same super, those constructor informations are going to handle inside this particular throwable class. Now what you understand here? Any class, either it is a checked exception or unchecked exception. So whatever the message you are writing here internally, it is going to handle by the particular class called throwable. Because so this is the super class for all the exceptions classes here. Now what happening internally? I'm going to show you what happened. I'm going to show you the throwable class is expecting one parameter that is called string. Now you can see where is that? Okay, so this is the other constructor is going to handle. This is the constructor is going to handle. Now what we are doing is whatever the message we are going to provide, the message is initialized into this particular detailed message. So detailed method, basically it is a type called throwable type. Okay, inside this particular throwable class, we are defining the detailed type, and it is having here the type you can see string here. Now you can observe carefully what is the message they are writing here. Okay, so just we are going to write the description about the exception. Description about this particular exception. So you can see specific details about the throwable. For example, file not found exception. This contains the name of the file that could not be found. That could not be found. So you are going to write the message here. What kind of the file we are trying to load? What kind of the file we are trying to load here? So whatever the file we are loading, the name of the file we are going to provide here. Okay. So just for understanding here, so why the exception is occurring? So what we are writing here, and what is the content is not available. What is the particular content is not available? We can write as the detailed message here. And after this, internally it is calling this fill in stack trace. What exactly it will do this particular method here? It will try to identify the exception information, and it will go into provide the all the object information here. Okay, so if you extend any class, runtime exception or exception class, by default all the exceptions are going to call this particular methods only. Now you can see they are trying to come up with a synchronize here. So we'll discuss this particular synchronize keyword in our upcoming classes. But what you need to understand basically, so this is the for all the exception, like either the checked exception or unchecked exception, this particular throwable class is going to call. Okay, so this is I want to provide the information. Now we'll move on to the writing our custom exception. So what is the best way of writing the custom exception? And here, so just we can define the subclass of this particular runtime exception or exception here. Let me write the simple example. Here only I'm going to write the name of the exception is nothing but my exception. Okay, so this particular my exception is going to extend from the runtime exception. Now, so the runtime exception internally is going to expect the first one is a default constructor. Okay, I'm calling super constructor, and one more constructor I'm expecting it something like string message, and you can call super message here. Getting the point? And if you are interested to write a throwable object, you can define. But right now, we are not going to create any throwable object here. Okay, so this is we need to handle here. And now what I'm doing here, so this section code we'll discuss later. So why I'm generating this particular serial version UID? Basically, whenever we are trying to serialize our object and deserialize our object, this particular serial version UID is going to play important role here. Okay, so this is not the good time to discuss about this particular section. We'll see in our upcoming classes. But now just we created the my exception object here. Now what I will do, so inside this particular whatever we discussed in the earlier example, let me close all the exceptions what we discussed so far. So demo one, not this. Okay, here instead of this particular null pointer exception, my exception is nothing but this is the custom exception. Okay, now if I'm not handling this, if you observe carefully, I'm trying to handle basically null pointer exception, but here we are trying to throw the different exception, something like my exception. Now you can see, so this is the custom exception message we added, and now you can see, so this is the custom exception what we created here. So why the default handler is handle this? Why this particular default handler is handle this particular exception? Because so whatever the catch block we defined here, the catch block is handling different exception. Catching the point? He is handling different exception. Now what I will do here, I'm going to come up with this particular my exception. Now see the differences here. So this is the another way of handling the exception. So now you can see this particular my exception method from where we are writing here from my exception. Yeah. So this is the method we are defining, and it is contain this particular exception information, and these are all the two finally blocks. Now, so whatever the exception we created, it is handling the same way the previous exception what we defined here. Okay, this is important. So only the way of writing simply we can extend from the runtime exception or exception classes. We can define the particular constructor what you want to write here. Okay, so this is the way of writing the custom exceptions here. Any questions? Okay, so if I'm not like we don't have any sessions here, so what we will do, we'll try to move on to this particular important concept to call multi-threading programming. So this section we can discuss in our tomorrow session here. Okay, if I'm going to start, it's going to take multiple time. So we'll continue tomorrow the new concept to call multi-threading. So basically, once we completed this particular multi-threading here, now what is the main important concept we are going to discuss here, and we'll try to identify the auto boxing and auto unboxing few concepts we'll discuss here, and later some of the input output stream, file input stream and file output stream related example we are going to discuss. So finally we'll move on to the generic and as well as lambda and collection framework. So these are all the pending topics we are going to discuss here. Okay, so most probably in 10 days we are going to close all the core Java related concepts here. Okay, so we'll continue tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.